The genotype. Genotype is basically a basic concept of the genetics, and we want to highlight these basic concepts of genetics to understand or to refresh our concepts of the basic genetics, because evolutionary computing or biologically inspired computation has been inspired from these biological concepts, and they are applying those basic concepts to these evolutionary algorithms, which we will try to model and understand in the coming module. So that's why we are interested to highlight or to refresh our basic concepts of these genetics. Molecular biology, genotype is one among those basic concepts, which we will discuss it with reference to the artificial evolution as well. Before going into the details of the genotype, let us just highlight the basic works due to which progress being made towards the identification of the genotype, or the concept of genotype and the phenotype. Genetics is linked with Mendel, and Mendel in 1965 he came up with his ideas of the basic genetic material. He postulated that when organisms are transmitting characters from one generation to the next generation, so they are doing this by transmitting some specific particles or entities. He didn't name these particles the genetic material, but that was later on being named as the genetic material or the genes. The concept of gene was kind later on from the Mendel time, but he really identified a concept about or the theme about these genetic materials, and he postulated that organisms are transmitting these characteristics or these particles to their own offspring during the process of sexual reproduction. And recent progress in genetics has confirmed, or providing different types of clues to confirm that, to confirm the existence of variations and transmission of characteristics from the parents to offsprings. When Darwin was postulating his theories of evolution, he was probably not aware of the work of Mendel, and that's why at that time the theories of evolution was not basically relied on genetics. They were basically relying on some different parameters and aspects, including the morphology, including the biogeography and some other characteristics. But these days, genetics has become an integral part of the evolution, and genetics is providing clues to the phylogenies, and today there is an established field of the molecular phylogenies in which we deal with the phylogenetic relationships or the evolutionary relationships of the organisms through these genotyping or the genetic makeup of the individuals. So we can say that the genetic material of the individual basically is known as the genotype, while its manifestation as an organism is the phenotype. So there are two terms which are very important to be refreshed: the genotype and the phenotype. The genetic material is actually the genotype of that individual. So every individual has its own genotype, and the manifestation of that genotype as an organism or as a character is called as the phenotype. In artificial evolution, both these concepts are basically used. We will discuss them during the artificial evolution processes and the algorithms. There will be phenotypes and genotype concepts to be applied over there for evaluations or during the raising of the population, the artificial populations of data. Natural selection operates solely on the phenotype, but the genotype is the ultimate vehicle of inheritance. So both these are very, very important concepts. Evolution, natural selection solely relies on phenotype, and the genotype is its ultimate vehicle. So because transmission is to be made by this genotype. Now, the extent to which we are determined by our genotype or our phenotype, or the relationship in between the genotype and the phenotype, this is a much debatable issue and needs further discussions. We are not going into the details of this, the relationships of these two for the determination or how much, or how they determined us, or how much, or up to how extent we are determined by either the genotype or the phenotype or the relationships of these two. It also to be kept in mind that cells contain not only the genetic material of the organism, cells also contain another class of molecules. They are known as proteins, and the basic functionalities directly or indirectly are being made by these protein molecules. The shape of the protein molecule, the concentration of the protein molecule, the behavior of the protein molecules, and other properties of the proteins, they determine the properties of the cell. So all the properties of the cell are due to the shape, the concentration, and the behavior of these protein molecules in the cell. And different cells are different from each other because of the presence or absence of different proteins in these different types of cells, or due to the concentration difference of these different proteins in different cells. For example, we have muscle cells, and we have brain cells, we have stomach cells, we have different types of cells in different tissues of our body. The genetic makeup of all these types of cells is the same within the same individual or within the same species, but different types of cells are different because of the presence of different types of proteins in them. So it's basically the proteins which make the cells different from each other, and which make them different with respect to different functionalities. So the definition of specific proteins depends on other molecule that's known as DNA, because the DNA defines proteins, because when DNA gets expressed, it can produce proteins. Not every time the expression of DNA protein, because there are some DNA molecules which never express into proteins, but there are genes which produce proteins. And DNA is basically the genetic material which we are talking about, and which make the genotype. So the genetic material in the cell is organized into systematic structures, a compact structure known as chromosomes, and the number of chromosomes and the quantity of DNA in these chromosomes vary among different species. So every species has its own density of DNA in their chromosomes, and they have their specific number of chromosomes of that species. For example, humans have 23 sets of chromosomes in their diploid cells. So another species may have a different sets of chromosomes in their cells. So every species has a variable number of vary in their number of chromosomes and the density of DNA present in them. And the human has around about 3.2 billion base pairs of DNA in their genetic makeup, in their genome. And this redundant structure of this DNA make it capable to have a property of the replication, because if the genetic material is to be passed on to other generation, it must be replicated, because the resultant cells must get an equal copy and equal quantity of the same DNA from their parents, so it must be replicated. Now this replication is taking place during the process of cell divisions. There are two types of cell divisions. One is the mitosis and the other one is meiosis. One is taking place in the somatic cells, and the other one is taking place in the germ cells. And these will be discussed in detail in the coming module.